Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping way back in time to explore one of the most dramatic, complex, and honestly just fascinating eras in ancient history. We're talking about post-exilic Judaism, specifically looking at the period right after 539 BC. I want you to imagine an entire civilization that's been totally uprooted, conquered, and scattered across an empire, suddenly being given the chance to pack up, return home, and rebuild. It's a story packed with massive geopolitical shifts, incredibly high-stakes court drama, and just the sheer grit it takes to reconstruct a cultural identity totally from scratch.
But that brings up a really huge question. It's kind of like a massive historical jigsaw puzzle. How exactly do we piece together what actually happened to the Jewish people after the devastating fall of Babylon? I mean, how does a community reestablish its roots when the world around them is completely changed and the land they're returning to is filled with people who frankly don't exactly want them back? Well, the answer to that lies in some truly incredible ancient documents and narratives.
Okay, let's dive into this. To unravel all this history, we're drawing from an absolutely fascinating Old Testament literature lecture by Dr. Elaine Phillips. We're going to decode her insights today and really bring this ancient world to life, focusing heavily on the books of Ezra and Esther. And let me tell you, these aren't just dry religious texts. We're talking about brilliant political documentaries and darkly ironic court dramas.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with sourcing ancient history, meet the Persian kings, dive into Ezra's documentary style, explore the irony of the Persian court, and finally unpack the incredible plot and providence of Esther. Starting off with Section 1, Sourcing Ancient History, Unearthing the Past.
So how do we actually know what we know about this era? We kind of have to use a dual toolkit. On one side, we've got our biblical sources, right? Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Esther, and Malachi. But we definitely don't read these in a vacuum. We also rely heavily on extra-biblical sources. We've got Greek historians like Herodotus, who gives us these incredible vivid details about the Persian Empire's encounters with Greece. We look to the Jewish historian Josephus, and absolutely crucially, we look at actual physical Persian inscriptions and archaeological materials.
And that perfectly brings us to a brilliant piece of physical evidence, the famous Cyrus cylinder, which you can actually go see in the British Museum today. Before the Persian Empire, the Assyrians and Babylonians had this brutally simple policy. They conquered people, took them into exile, and essentially shuffled them around to completely obliterate their national identity. But Cyrus the Great, he completely changed the game. He instituted a totally new policy, recorded right here on this cylinder, to actually send exiled people back to their lands so they could rebuild their own worship establishments. It was essentially a massive public relations ploy, but it's exactly what set the stage for the Jews to finally return to Jerusalem.
Moving to Section 2, the Persian kings, the main cast of characters.
Now, to really understand the timeline of our returning exiles, we've got to know the geopolitical heavyweights calling the shots. We start in 539 BC with Cyrus the Great, the man who gave the decree to restore Jerusalem. He's followed by Cambyses, whose reign ended pretty quickly and tragically on his way back from Egypt. Then, in 522 BC, we get Darius I. Now, Darius is a big deal because it's under his rule and with a whole lot of prodding from the prophets Haggai and Zechariah that the Jewish temple is finally completed. Next up, in 486 BC, we have Xerxes, who you might also know from the Hebrew text as Ahasuerus. He is the, let's say, very volatile king we'll meet in the story of Esther. And finally, in 465 BC, we have Artaxerxes, the king under whom Ezra and Nehemiah actually lived and worked.
Let's dive into Section 3, Ezra's ancient documentary, Rebuilding an Identity.
Think of Ezra as a statesman, a priest, and a scribe who's looking backward in time to compile history. He actually starts by documenting the very decree that set the whole thing in motion. Cyrus states that the God of heaven has appointed him to build a temple in Jerusalem. But what's truly fascinating here is that Cyrus commands that the returning Jews be provided with silver, gold, goods, and livestock. Now, if that sounds familiar, it absolutely should. Ezra is totally framing this as a second Exodus. Just like the Israelites left Egyptian bondage wealthy and well-supplied centuries earlier, they are now leaving Babylonian exile in the exact same way.
So the crucial point is that Ezra constructs this narrative exactly like a modern historical documentary. He's pulling in archived letters, Aramaic court documents, Aramaic being the international trade language of the time, and these massive, extensive lists of names. Now, I know, Modern readers don't usually get super excited about ancient genealogies, but for a returning community facing heavy, everyday opposition from locals and Samaritans who really wanted to syncretize and mix their worship, these lists were everything. It was literally how they proved their authenticity and firmly established their absolute identity in a really hostile land.
Which brings us to Section 4, Irony in the Persian Court. The Drama of Esther.
While Ezra gives us all this meticulous administration, the Book of Esther takes a completely different tone. It is a brilliantly dark comedy, and it actually kicks off with some really fascinating linguistic trivia. King Xerxes throws this wildly lavish 180-day feast just to show off his glorious kingdom. The Hebrew word used here for feast is mishta, and that literally comes from a root word meaning to drink. Historically, we know Xerxes is about to head west to try and conquer Greece. So, let's be real. This isn't just a fancy dinner party. This 6-month drinking binge is essentially a massive, opulent attempt to secure political and military support for his upcoming Greek campaign.
The author of Esther is deliberately poking fun at the Persian court's opulence and, quite frankly, its stupidity. The whole narrative is just dripping with irony. You have the king wanting to display his unimaginable wealth, but when he orders his wife, Queen Vashti, to be displayed, she flat out refuses. The most powerful man on the planet gets publicly dumped. His advisors immediately panic, terrified that all the women in the empire are going to revolt, so they issue a public, empire-wide royal decree just to ban her and rigidly enforce male dominance in their households. They take a petty domestic spat and escalate it into a ridiculous state crisis. We are literally supposed to laugh at this. It perfectly sets the stage by showing us that the mighty Persian court operates on the absurd, fragile whims of the king's advisors.
And now for Section 5, the plot and the providence, Esther's climax.
So, with Vashti permanently banned, a young, orphaned, marginalized Jewish girl named Esther gets unexpectedly thrust into the very center of Persian power, guided by her cousin Mordecai. And right here is where the literature connects to some really deep history. Mordecai is specifically identified as being from the tribe of Benjamin. Why does that matter? Well, think back. Israel's very first king, Saul, was a Benjaminite. Centuries earlier, God commanded Saul to completely wipe out the Amalekites and their king Agag, but Saul totally failed to finish the job. Now, fast forward to the Persian court. The villain of our story, Haman, the guy who plots to annihilate the Jews, is an Agagite, a direct descendant of that very same king Agag. The author is brilliantly showing us that Mordecai is about to finish the ancient, unresolved business of his ancestor Saul.
So Haman is furious that Mordecai refuses to bow to him, so he actually convinces the king to issue a decree against the Jews. But listen closely to the language he uses. He tells the king this half-truth about a separatist people and asks for a decree to destroy them. The Hebrew word there is la'abed, but with a very slight linguistic tweak, that word can also mean to enslave. So it is entirely possible that King Xerxes and maybe even Mordecai at first thought Haman was simply paying to have the Jewish people sold into the slave trade. But when the actual official decree is written, Haman uses 3 very distinct words: destroy, kill, and annihilate. The true insidious nature of the plot is suddenly out in the open.
When the horrifying truth is revealed, Mordecai tears his clothes in sackcloth and ashes, and he appeals to Queen Esther with what has to be one of the most famous lines in all of ancient literature. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Mordecai bluntly warns her that if she remains silent, she's going to perish anyway. Esther, despite the terrifying law that approaching the king uninvited could literally mean her execution, agrees to fast for 3 days and approach Xerxes, making that legendary statement, "If I perish, I perish."
Let's see how this builds, because this is where the story shifts from desperate human planning to just incredible divine providence. Esther invites the king and Haman to a banquet. But before she even reveals Haman's plot, something happens that absolutely no human could plan. The very night before Haman plans to execute Mordecai, the king gets insomnia. He literally can't sleep, so he asks for the royal chronicles to be read to him. And exactly at that moment, he hears the record of how Mordecai had previously saved his life from an assassination plot and was never actually rewarded for it. I mean, the timing is impossibly perfect. Haman arrives in the morning to ask for Mordecai's head, and instead, the king forces Haman to parade Mordecai through the streets in massive honor. The tables are just completely turned, leading straight to Haman's downfall and the ultimate salvation of the Jewish people.
This miraculous, totally unexpected reversal is exactly why the Book of Esther has been so incredibly important to the Jewish people throughout their history, especially during long centuries of persecution. Just listen to this powerful quote from the 12th century Jewish scholar Maimonides: "If all the books of the Hebrew Bible were to vanish, except the Torah and Esther, that would be enough."
That is the profound, enduring power of this historical narrative. It's the ultimate story of survival, constantly reminding its readers that deliverance can arrive from the most unlikely of places at the exact right time.
Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. If a text filled with 180-day drinking binges, ancient tribal blood feuds, and deeply ironic court politics can survive millennia just to offer such profound, life-saving hope to an entire civilization, what hidden layers of history might you be missing in the books you thought you already knew? Keep digging, keep questioning, and always keep exploring the past. Thanks so much for joining us on this explainer, and we will catch you next time.